What's up, everybody, and welcome to CannaBev. Today is a new talk and toke with a very, very special guest. I am very excited this is happening. You may have seen this person's reference in, I don't know, CannaBev season 1, I believe episode 2. Don't even remember the number of my episodes. But this man and this book has been a reference multiple times on CannaBev. It's been a great reference for me. I've flashed this a few times at you folks. Tremendous reference, but let's talk about this person. Jason Wilson, MS. Jason Wilson is a biologist and science communicator with a passion for sharing his general curiosity about the world with others, which is why he founded Natural Learning Enterprises. He's a host of the Curious About Cannabis podcast and the author of the Curious About Cannabis, a scientific introduction to a controversial plant, and education children's book, A Toadstool's Treasure. I want to read that book. Jason holds a philosophy BA with a psychology minor from the University of Mississippi and a master's of science degree specializing in biology and education from Southern Oregon University. He is currently a professor of cannabinoid science at John Patrick University and has worked previously as a botanist and natural products researcher studying native plants and ethnobotanicals, both in the field and in the lab. He is a certified Audubon naturalist, studied permaculture design with Siskiyou Permaculture, probably said that wrong, led by first-generation students of Bill Mollison, and practiced natural building and ecology conscious agriculture principles as an intern at the Southern Oregon Permaculture Institute. In his free time, Jason enjoys spending time with his wife and daughter, writing, playing music, hiking, and spending time in the garden. I already want to be this man's friend. Folks, please welcome Jason Wilson, MS, from Curious About Cannabis. What's up, Jason? How are you?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks so much for inviting me on. It's been, I've appreciated the support you've offered me, and it's great to be able to come on your program and talk about all things cannabis science and anything else we get into.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Yeah, like I said, this is, first of all, I wish I had like a press opening like that. That is awesome. Boss move. I think that's great. One day when I grow up and I'm as awesome, I will have something cool like that. But seriously, the Curious About Cannabis book has been a tremendous reference for me. I mean, it's I like the way, that it's set up, like, almost like a textbook. Like it's a college level, textbook, but it's not, dry and boring. And I think it's really great. It's been a tremendous reference for me. And I really, really, I'm happy that you, offered that to
Thanks
the
so
community. Yeah, absolutely, man. Like this has helped me tremendously with, how I make my content and how I view cannabis. Not just as as a commodity, but also its healing nature as well. Most importantly, because that's really a lot about what the information is in this book is about the healing potential of cannabis. But we will get into that later. So, like, most importantly, well, I should ask you this. Like, it says Jason Wilson, MS. Like, you're like there. It's like you could almost be like some kind of like cannabis villain or something like
Sure,
that,
yeah.
the mad science Workington. So like yes, exactly. I'm gonna smoke this one. They'll drive all the kids crazy. It's like, I just want to know that's not what you're doing in your off time. I don't want to support somebody who's up to something like that. You don't have any kind of nefarious plans in the world of
Who
cannabis, do
knows?
you?
I have all sorts of schemes and adventuring that I do. I like the idea of maybe
Good.
being a secret villain in the background. I don't think my personality quite fits, but I love the idea, so I'll accept it.
Here's the thing. What I really like about that is that you left the opportunity open. So
Exactly.
something to look forward to. I mean, 2020 just passed. Cannabis supervillain
Why
2021.
not?
We'll give you time. 2023.
Yeah, exactly.
Will
Give me a
work
couple
out just
years.
fine.
Yeah, give me a couple
Right,
years to
right.
set things in motion, and my grand schemes will come into fruition.
I can't wait. I can't wait. So yeah, please tell us, like what got you into this field initially.
Sure, yeah. So my professional background with cannabis goes back to my time at the University of Mississippi. So when I was there, even though at the time when I was doing my undergraduate work, my degrees in philosophy and almost double majored in psychology, but I was also working for the IT department for the school. And through serendipity, I ended up kind of becoming in the time that I was there, sort of a go-to technician for the Cannabis Research and Development Lab at the University of Mississippi, which is at the time, and I think still, one of the only federally approved cannabis research laboratories in the United States. And then I also ended up doing a lot of work with, there's a huge natural products research center at the University of Mississippi, one of the biggest in the country. And so I ended up spending a lot of time in labs, basically, and getting to know a lot of scientists. And I got tours of the cannabis facilities. And in doing all of that, I started to think, well, maybe I want to reroute my career. Because at the time I was thinking about, maybe going to med school. And so that's kind of what I was preparing for. I was interested in psychiatry. And so it's not a commonly known thing, but actually philosophy majors are some of the highest scores on the MCATs. So that was some of the thinking that went into that. Plus, I'm obsessed with just critical thinking and philosophy and logic and stuff. So it was a good fit. But then, I had all these conversations with these scientists. I loved being in the labs. And one of them in particular that worked for the USDA that I spent a lot of time with, he was like, you really should be in natural product science. He's like, you're made for it. And I was like, I don't know. So that kind of seed was planted in my brain for a while. And then I moved to Oregon and, went to grad school. And while I was in grad school, that's when I started working in botany and became a botanist for the Bureau of Land Management out there. It's a federal, organization that studies plants. And they're kind of notoriously known for work around like logging and stuff, but also little known thing, they have a native plant research arm that unfortunately doesn't get a ton of funding, but I happened to get in there and had a really great time studying native plants all around Southern Oregon. And, we had a little lab there. And then after that job, I ended up getting a job at an actual natural products lab that was pivoting into cannabis at the time. They knew that cannabis testing was going to be a thing that was going to be really, really important, that they saw that law changes in Oregon were right on the horizon. I mean, this was before legalization in Oregon and in the days of the medical cannabis program, before there were rules for testing. So it was a very kind of wild frontier. But that really, really interested me because it connected me back to my experiences at the University of Mississippi. And I was like, okay, it'd be great to, kind of come full circle and now be a scientist working in a lab, that was like the labs that I used to work in, fixing their instruments and stuff. And so that's kind of where everything started. And then from there, I worked in that lab for quite a while, helping to build that out. We eventually sold that lab. I ended up running a network of labs for a short time, and then ended up kind of branching off and did some R&D work for product manufacturers, helping them build in-house analytical labs and constructing research projects and that sort of thing. And then eventually decided to step out on my own, and that's what I've been doing since. So I do a lot of teaching. I also am a scientific advisor for, several different companies. And then I also just do random cannabis and non-cannabis science related consulting for different companies, usually around herbal products and that sort of thing, kind of usually in the same sphere, but not always the cannabis plant.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, man. Thanks. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome to hear, because like at the root of where you're coming from with cannabis and what you're doing and the podcast and the YouTube and all of that, it sounds like a guy building the gig that he wants.
Yeah.
Is really at the root of this, and that's great, dude. Like that's what CannaBev is all about, really. It's like it's something that I'm passionate about, interested in what it brings to humanity. A lot of people on YouTube and on Instagram and other Talking Toke episodes it's all a bunch of, folks just, building their, their way through this world,
Yeah.
betting on themselves, and taking a step forward. And that's a big deal. That's great, man. That's great to hear. All right. So like you talked about like the wild frontier of cannabis.
Mhm.
So like, are there like the cowboys of cannabis, the guys who's just doing crazy shit? Or is it just kind of like you're testing what for why or splicing what with why? Is there something like that going on? Like, can you speak of this, or is this something like talked about behind closed
Oh
doors?
no, yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. I don't work for anybody anymore,
There's
so
other there's other cannabis like supervillains out there hatching their own
yeah.
plots. They already
Oh
exist.
yeah, they've been at work for a long time. Yeah, man. I mean, so first of all, I appreciate what you said about, me sort of building my way through, because that's just kind of been in my nature my whole life, is like figure out the direction you want to go, and you don't always know how to get there, but you just stay focused on, continuing to work towards your passion. And then I firmly believe that when you orient yourself that way, you recognize opportunities that you wouldn't recognize otherwise. And that's what carves that path forward. And I mean, it's just a crazy series of serendipitous moments and seized opportunities that got me to where I am now. So, and that's one reason why I'm glad to be here with you, because I recognize that in you as well. And I like supporting people that recognize that you are valuable, your dreams are valuable and worth pursuing. And even if you don't know how to get to where you're going, or maybe you don't even know where you're going, just taking those steps forward is really important. And I'm very passionate about supporting that. Now, getting to the wild frontier, there's a couple stories I can share to paint a picture of what things used to be like, what they're like now, and where they might be going. So when I first got into the cannabis testing world, like I said, there were not regulations on anything really. And so, first of all, no one cared about testing. No one really wanted to know anything other than what their THC number was, and they wanted it to be the highest number possible. And they wanted that number to be reported within like hours. They didn't want to wait days to get their test results back. So, the early days, it was
So
a lot
like
of
so like no curing process, none of that. It's like no, like we cut it off the branch, we bag it, and we send it someplace to get tested. Tested.
No, it was usually cured material ready to go. And generally, they were only getting things tested because it helped them differentiate themselves to dispensaries. So, at this time, dispensaries were a thing. They had just really started. So, when I moved to Oregon, dispensaries weren't even legal. There were quote unquote nonprofit collectives that were dispensaries, but you couldn't really call them that. And you didn't really buy anything. You just donated money, but everything had a price. And so you're like, well, what if I don't want to pay the donation? What if I just want to take what I want and leave? You can't do that. Well, then is it a donation? So it kind of came from that background and then slowly evolved. And so eventually they legalized dispensaries for the medical program. And then after that, they were like, maybe we need to set some rules on the quality of the cannabis products that are in these dispensaries. And so that's what
Maybe
kind
a
of got
little less mold, a
yeah,
little less
yeah.
mold, a little less bugs, that kind of stuff, spraying, that kind of stuff.
And that was really the main focus, was mold and pesticides, but uh no one had like a refined idea on what pesticides were a problem or what they should test for. And so the first iteration of rules that came out in Oregon basically said, you've got to test for mold, you got to test potency, and you have to do pesticide testing, but we're not going to tell you what pesticides to test for. Just test for pesticides across 4 broad classes of pesticides. And so you had labs that were testing for maybe literally 4 pesticides, 1 pesticide per category. And then you had labs like the approach we took, because we viewed the pesticide issue as one of the most important, is we actually found an agricultural lab that's all they did was pesticide testing. And we're like, okay, we want to partner with you. And so through that partnership, we were able to offer screens of anywhere from a dozen to 400 pesticides, depending on what people wanted. And so that started to kind of give you a sense, because you'd find some people that really cared, really wanted to know how clean something was, and they would spring for the 200 pesticide panel or the 400 pesticide panel, and want that information and value it. Whereas, a lot of people just wanted the bare minimum to stay compliant, and, would go for just the basic, I can't remember how many pesticides were on our sort of most minimum screening, but it was like the most dangerous pesticides that people might, DDT and other stuff that people might come
You
on.
may grow an extra arm or something like
Right.
that kind of
Yeah.
pesticides.
The more serious ones. But in those days too, like there wasn't any seed to sale tracking like there is now, no oversight. And so we were competing with labs that were not doing anything, that were just taking in samples. Someone would throw them extra money and say, this is what we'd like our test results to look like. And they got a PDF that said those things. And that was, what we were up against. And we were also up against people that, were offering absurd turnaround times that we were like, just how are these labs offering results in under 24 hours at like $30 or $60 when we know what it costs? And so you kind of had this race to the bottom in lab testing, which is really weird, really, really weird for me coming from my background and what I was used to. And we sort of held our line. We're like, we don't take bribes. We're not, rushing anything. We're instituting quality controls that we would expect in any natural products lab. And the consequence of that is our THC numbers tended to be lower on average than our competitors, and our turnaround times were slower. And so that hurt for a long time until the state was like, actually, labs should be accredited and you should be testing for like 60 pesticides. And then the playing field leveled out quite a bit. But one story that's, I think, to really give people context of the pressures that we faced. I mean, one time we literally had a guy come into the lab at we were getting ready to close. It was maybe 4 o'clock, in the afternoon. And he comes in with, just this really, he looked like a bodyguard, really buff dude. He had his pit bull with him and he had a gun strapped to his side. And he came in.
So he's playing the part. He made sure he wore the costume for the drop off.
Right. Yeah. And he just, said pretty plainly, like, I want my test results. And we're like, well, they're not going to be ready for, a couple days. And he's like, well, I want them right now. And you're like, at this point, I'm thinking like, okay, so do I just pretend to go get them and leave out the back door? Like, what's the situation here?
That's next level.
It was
dude was playing the part. Holy shit.
No, it was total intimidation. And that was not uncommon. Our pesticide testing partner that same year called us to tell us the same thing happened to them. Totally different person, but the same sort of thing. Someone came in strapped, demanding results, basically right then. So you had these weird dynamics going on. That's
a very nice way to put it. We had these strange dynamics going on in the Oregon market when it came down to testing. This man would just show up. It's like, all right, it's a fine point to it,
Yeah, I mean, it's like you didn't, as a scientist coming into it, you don't expect that you might have to specialize in self-defense or extreme negotiations to get through your workday. But that's kind of the way it was for a while. All sorts of interesting characters came through. I mean, one guy, this was even in the news. We had one guy, one of our clients, ended up getting robbed and like tortured and stuff. There was like crazy things going on. This is like 2014 that some of this is going on. So quite a while back now. So that's one extreme. And then as rules kind of came into play, the lab testing environment standardized so people couldn't cheat as easily. So, I remember when legalization happened and all the labs had to be accredited and everything, instantly the THC numbers for all products in Oregon fell to right around our average. And I felt so vindicated. I was like, yes, finally. But then after about a year, labs start to find ways to cheat even under the accredited systems. And then you start to see inflated numbers again. And that's sort of where we're at. Like you can generally often trust your contaminant data, thank God. That you can trust your pesticide data usually and your microbial data, but the potency data and terpene data is still all over the place because it drives the value of the product. And so there's just so much incentive for labs to kind of tweak things a little bit, try to push numbers a little higher through little tricks that about, because if you get accredited, all the things you're not supposed to do, and then you're like, oh well, okay, I see how you could easily get around that. And that's sure enough, that's what a host of labs have done. There's definitely a lot of good ones out there, but it's still a little Wild West.
Crazy. That's some crazy. That's next level. That is some Wild West shit. All right. In lieu of that, we have to do something on Talk and Toke. We have to do some deep thinking. So we're going to take a short break here to do some deep thinking. All right. I'm thinking heavily about many things. Unfortunately, I can't keep all the thoughts in my head straight. I'm really happy that I got to take that break. What a wonderful time to be doing a Talk and Toke right now. All right, so once again, we are back with Jason William from the Curious About Cannabis YouTube and book. So yes, Jason, let's talk about Curious About Cannabis and YouTube and, what that's all about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so basically Curious About Cannabis is, it's kind of become a lot of things. It started out simply enough. It's a brand that sort of grew out of a series of workshops I used to teach, going back to, basically, the lab that I started working in back in 2014, pretty much a year after I started working there, I was like, I want to, really educate the community because of some of the things that I already mentioned of how crazy things were, and probably some things we'll get into, but I wanted to, really get involved in education. And that started out being guest lectures and seminars that I was doing at universities, and it evolved into a workshop series I put together. And in that workshop, I was like, man, I really need a textbook that covers like all of these different concepts that I'm teaching about. And I hunted around and couldn't really find anything. They're really good cannabis science textbooks, don't get me wrong there, but a lot of them are written for pretty technical audiences, and then the ones that aren't tend to be focused on cultivation and not much else. And so there was this just big niche there that needed to be filled. And so I started writing what were essentially like essays that I would share with my students as part of the workshop. And those essays ended up getting compiled into this like little bound notebook thing that I would get printed at Staples, and then that evolved into the first edition of the Curious About Cannabis book. And then one thing led to another. And then we released the second edition recently, which was quite a bit bigger and more refined and took into account a lot of newer research that came out after around 2015 or so. And then from there, I was like, the book is nice and the workshops are fun and everything, but I'm having all of these conversations with my colleagues that I think would be very, very helpful to people to hear. And the conversations are fun too. And I love podcasts. I'm a big, just podcast listener in general. So I was like, well, let's just see what it's like to start a podcast and we'll see how that goes. And, it'll be the Curious About Cannabis podcast, a spinoff of the book. And that's a spinoff of the workshops. And so, I don't know, what was that, 2017 or 2018, I started collecting interviews. I way over prepared, way overthought the idea of launching a podcast. I was like, okay, I'm going to get, all these episodes in the bank and, get all this editing done and drip them out and everything. And so by the time I actually released the podcast, I had like a year's worth of material and realized like that becomes problematic. And so I've learned a lot through that process.
I wish I could sit down and make a year's worth of content. That is awesome, man. That's a skill. That is focus, man. Cheers to you.
Well, it was just, I hate to even claim that it was focused. It was just like, I just felt all this pressure that I was going to screw up. And so it's like, I'll get more interviews than I think I need in case some of them aren't great. And, just all these different rationalizations I had, because I overthink things in general. I'm an analytical scientist, so I overanalyze things. That's what I do. And the philosophy major doesn't help at all because I spent so long studying logic and overthinking things that way too.
This is perfect. This totally sets up your origin story as a cannabis villain.
It does. It really does.
He was just driven right. Yes. He was driven insane by his incessant need to think about cannabis and analytics.
You can just imagine me pacing.
Cracked.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. One person came up to him and he finally said, "Sir, I want the cannabis with the highest THC level." And he cracked and he just freaked out on everyone. And that's where this all came to be.
In a sense, that's actually not too far from the truth, because in the workshops, that was an issue that came up a lot of like, how do we conceptualize these THC numbers and the terpenes, and what does it mean? And, questions that my students submit now have become much more refined over the last 6 years. But when it started out, some of the questions were literally like, what product will get me the most high? What product is the best at treating XYZ condition? And that, I was like, whoa, okay. Like, those questions are very loaded, and it showed me that there were things that I had in my mind that I'd been thinking about from looking at the chemistry of these products for so long that other people just didn't have, because why would they? And so that really catapulted things for me of like, okay, I really need to start talking to people more and teaching more and sharing what I'm learning in the lab and get it out there, because it's going to really help people find products that work better for them. Hopefully they won't waste money or waste time and resources hunting for products that really are not what they're looking for. So in a sense, some of this did start with, the classic question of like, how do I find the most potent product, or, the highest THC number? And some of those early workshops were dispensary training workshops. And so, I talked to a lot of dispensary technicians or bud tenders, and asked them like, what are the most common questions you get from people that, come into the dispensary? And with every single one, what product has the highest THC number? That was always the most common question that these bud tenders were getting. And so, I guess we can just jump into that, because maybe people listening have that same question of like, how should we think about the THC number? And,
Yes.
It's complicated is usually what I'll say, because, early on it was all about THC. Now the culture has kind of shifted and it's all about terpenes, and people are really obsessed about terpenes. And I think both sort of missed the mark a little bit. And so, first off, I'll say that, certainly there's just a ton more to cannabis than THC. And in case people aren't familiar, the cannabis plant can produce, up to 140, 150 or more cannabinoids that have been identified so far. Certainly there'll be more that are identified. As scientists have been working with the cannabis plant, they form predictions of compounds they think they'll find based on compounds they've already found. So for instance, when THC was found, researchers speculated that, okay, THC is this molecule that it's, for any chemistry people out there, it's a tricyclic compound, and it has this little carbon tail coming off of the main series of rings in the molecule. Well, researchers started to speculate, well, what if that little chain of carbon atoms off of that main molecule, what if it were longer? What if it were shorter? And they start hunting for those things, because they can say, okay, we have some sense of what the molecular mass is going to be, how it would reflect light and things, which all plays into how you would test for those things. And sure enough, they start to find them. They find THCV, which has a shorter carbon tail. They find THCP, which has a longer carbon tail. And so there are other compounds out there that scientists, are fairly certain probably exist in cannabis, but just haven't been identified yet. And it's a long process to look for things that have never been looked for before. So that's why I put that asterisk there that, 140, 150 cannabinoids so far, but there will surely be more that are found. And even the definition of what a cannabinoid is changing the more we learn about them. And that's a whole other thing that I'll get into later, I guess. But so you've got these 100, 150 cannabinoids, but then when you get into terpenes or terpenoids, and to clarify the language there, which most people don't care, but some people might be nitpicky, technically a terpene only consists of hydrogen and carbon. So a true terpene is a hydrocarbon. A terpenoid would include the multitudes of similar compounds that have like an oxygen in them or some other functional group or something that, where they're not pure hydrocarbons. But so that's the difference between a terpene and a terpenoid. And when you get into terpenoids, I mean, there are hundreds in the cannabis plant, certainly well over 200. And it's another one of those things of, as you hunt for more, surely you will find more. But beyond that, there are flavonoids in cannabis, which are these compounds that aren't quite as oil loving as cannabinoids and terpenes are. You can extract a lot of them in water. Generally, it's thought they have anti-inflammatory, antioxidant potential, very similar to cannabinoids. And even some of these flavonoids are thought to be unique to cannabis, but they're probably not, but because we haven't looked for them in other plants yet. But right now we claim that it's unique to cannabis. And these are called the canflavins. And there's, a dozen or 24 or more of those that have been identified in cannabis so far, flavonoids broadly. And then, you've got things like stilbenoids, aldehydes, phytosterols, all sorts of chemical compounds in cannabis that are all working in concert to produce effects in the body. So when you talk about like, how is a product going to affect somebody or get somebody really high or treat some medical condition, the first thing you have to look at is what's the full chemistry of the product that they're considering. But even if you know the complete chemistry of a product, that's still not enough, because you've also got your own chemistry that you're bringing to the table. And that is a lot harder to measure and quantify. So there are a lot of variables that go into your cannabis experience, and it's certainly not just THC. Now, that being said, there are THCA isolates and, really, really refined extracts that are almost 80, 90% THC, and some people like those. But generally, in my experience, talking to clinicians, talking to patients, and talking to bud tenders, and all these different people in the industry, a lot of people, after they get experience, tend to prefer products that have a greater diversity of chemistry that is closer to what you would find in the flower, that people have traditionally consumed for thousands of years. And even, like hashish is not a refined extract. And so I would say it still fits into that category of still being a very broad spectrum, product. But a lot of the newer stuff's more heavily refined. And so people are kind of learning that it's not all about THC. And some people, may get a cannabis flower that's like 25% THC, and compare that against a flower that's maybe 16% THC, but maybe the 16% THC has got a lot of other things going on to it. The smell is more complex and the taste is more interesting, which all indicates the presence of terpenes and flavonoids and aldehydes and all these other things. And a lot of people report that they actually get, quote unquote, subjectively higher from that 16% flower than they do the 25. And so, I mean, as kind of a roundabout way of saying that, yeah, it's really not all about the THC number. That being said, I also don't want people to assume that they should always go for the fullest spectrum either, because everyone is unique. And I know plenty of people that prefer isolates and prefer distillates for certain medical conditions they have. And I think that highlights the gaps of our understanding, that it'd be nice to be able to say that full spectrum is always better, but that's not always the case either. It just depends. And so this comes back to something I recommend for everybody is, if you're really serious about figuring out what your body likes the most, you've got to start journaling. You've got to start writing things down, keeping track of things. There are apps now that you can use, and figure out, what your unique relationship with cannabis should be, if that's something, that you're interested in exploring.
So please tell us about like the Natural Learning Academy and how, how journaling is actually really an important part of that.
Absolutely. So the Natural Learning Academy is an online learning platform that we launched sort of at the end of last year, the beginning of this year. It's largely a product of COVID-19 because, all of these workshops and seminars, lectures, and things that I had been doing were all in person, usually like community events at universities and different things. And then, when 2020 hit, it upended all of that in a big way. And I had been planning on getting into virtual learning, because I can see that it's going to continue to be a big thing forever. So I planned on it, didn't plan on pivoting so fast. So basically, I spent 2020 overhauling my workshops and seminars and everything I used to do, and trying to get them recorded and figure out how to take what I was doing in these workshops, which I think are very unique workshops, in that it's not so much about me delivering trivial information to people, but it's about creating an environment where people are literally diving into research papers, and we're talking about them, exploring, everyone's unique questions about cannabis, and trying to make sure, basically fostering a learning environment so that people can explore what they're interested in, while also, me sort of guiding them into certain concepts to make sure they have a really solid foundation. So how to do that in a virtual environment was tricky, but it took a year. We figured it out. And so we launched the Natural Learning Academy, which hosts all of the Curious About Cannabis online learning events and opportunities and stuff. And it'll also host other educational stuff as well. For Natural Learning Enterprises, Curious About Cannabis has just always been the flagship of testing the waters to see if an idea works or not. And then if it does, then we start spinning it out into a lot of the other areas that we that we teach on. Like you mentioned, I have a book about mushrooms for kids, Toadstool's Treasures. And so we have the Toadstool's Treasures brand is all about mycology education. We have a brand called Garden Wild, which is all about wildlife gardening and conservation. And so there's all these different things, and Curious About Cannabis is one. We have another one that we're releasing soon called Serious About Psychedelics, which is all about psychedelics. And then
I look forward to purchasing that publication.
Yeah, it's I'm still trying to figure out exactly how it's going to come together, because there's so many people diving into the psychedelic stuff, and I don't like doing the same thing that other people are doing. So I'm still figuring that out, but it's on its way. I'm gathering interviews already this year, over planning as I usually do. But to get to your point, so we just launched the Curious About Cannabis workshop series on the Natural Learning Academy. And in the workshop, one of the things that we focus on is journaling, like you mentioned. And so we work with a company called Gold Leaf that produces these really nice science-forward journals targeted towards the cannabis community. They started out with this one called the Patient Journal, but they now have all sorts of different journals. They have like a cannabis cooking journal, a journal specifically about CBD products, a journal for cultivators, so they're all about empowering people with print materials that are guided by science. And so part of the workshop is everyone gets one of these journals. And so we talk about all of these nuances on the chemistry of the plant. We talk about the science of the endocannabinoid system and how that plays into effects. And ultimately, it comes to this ultimate conclusion that sometimes irritates people of like, you really can't predict much when it comes to cannabis. Like, we'd like to say we can, and popular culture and media would make you think we can. There are even competitors of mine, other educational entities that teach about cannabis that's pretty much the main thing they do, is teach you that you can predict effects. But so that's just simply not the case. And placebo is a very problematic thing when it comes to cannabis, because for one thing, the endocannabinoid system is involved in the placebo effect itself. So it makes it very hard to untangle these things. And so I take that very seriously. And so my goal is to get people, our sort of catchphrase is, transcend the hype, get past the hype and the hearsay around cannabis. And to me, the way you do that is you stop paying attention to labels and memes and, what people are saying on forums, and you go to the science, you journal, and you pay attention to yourself. And if you're in a state that has doctors knowledgeable about cannabis and cannabinoids. You work, if you're a medical patient, you work with a knowledgeable healthcare provider, and you share this information that you're learning about yourself and everything, and you try to come to much more targeted game plans to get what you're after, you know? So it's the workshops. I think, like I said, I think they're extremely unique. Our first session starts next week. They run for 6 weeks. It's actually a 2-part series that runs for 12 weeks, split across 2 workshops. And each workshop is 6 weeks. And they basically happen every 2 months indefinitely until I am too tired to do them anymore. So people can learn about those if you go to cacpodcast.com/learn. That's where we've got some information about the workshops. We also have self-paced courses that are launching on the Natural Learning Academy as well. We've got like a dozen built now, and about a dozen more that we're queuing up before 420 and hoping to launch, around that time, because of course. And our goal is to populate the Natural Learning Academy site with at least 100 courses by the end of the year. Not necessarily all cannabis, but a lot of it is stuff that if you're into cannabis, you'll probably be into some of this other stuff. Like there's going to be a course on medicinal plants in general and how they tend to affect the body. And so cannabis is like a piece of that, but it really starts to expand the picture beyond cannabis to let's talk about plants in general and these metabolites they form and how they affect the body. So there's all sorts of interesting things that'll come on there. And I guess I can also say, because we're almost done and we'll be releasing it soon, we have another workshop that's going to release on there that'll teach people how they can test cannabis products at home for THC or CBD using really basic chromatography techniques that really anybody can do, trying to let people know it's like you can actually do some pretty cool home science experiments, and your results may not be perfectly accurate, but generally they'll be accurate enough for you to do something with that information to make better decisions for yourself. So that's the Natural Learning Academy. It's our online learning platform, and it's to me it's the future of Curious About Cannabis and a lot of the education work that we do.
One of the things that makes cannabis so special is that it's personal, and it's like, and I think when people start kind of looking, at cannabis with a little bit more of a specific eye, as you said, from what we know, what we don't know, and and journaling and being conscious of where we're at in that day and how and what kind of experience that you're looking for. And being specific about that, I think is really important, and is a great opportunity to, learn more about, I don't know, talk about,
well,
more.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I was just gonna say it forces you to self-reflect, and to me, I like it because I'm also really into like mindfulness and meditation and stuff, and so it's it's about trying to just get in tune with yourself. And it's so easy for all of us to become disconnected and to make assumptions, about our experiences that may not actually hold up under scrutiny. And so if you're trying to get at reality, that's the first step. Get in tune with yourself and understand what assumptions are you making, what beliefs have you formed in your mind that don't actually connect to anything real, that just stem from what you heard somebody say.
Something that I really wanted to, we talked a lot about, THC, and I wanted to ask a question about the most common misconception, and I think that's kind of one of the things that we've talked about. One of the things, like, we just talked about it, like the healing properties of cannabis.
Yeah.
Like, like, what do we know about it?
Yeah.
Like, from a personal standpoint, like, whether it cures or destroys cancer, like I feel like right now we can't be like 100% certain. It's like, oh yes, if you do this, it'll be that. Like, I know there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there, but like from a personal level, like when my grandmother passed away from cancer, like I wasn't like Chris is stoned. He's stoned all the time. He's stoned all the time. But when she wasn't well, like, Chris, do you have some of your pot, for grandma?
Yeah.
Like, and like, I made butter and she had brownies and stuff like that. And she ate and she had a nice, comfortable night and she was very, very chatty and she's kind of had her thing. And I was like, cannabis, it might not be killing her cancer, but look how happy and comfortable she is. Like there is value in that. And it's like, I think that's once again another one of those questions, right? What lens do we want to look at cannabis as far as its healing properties for people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll preface this with saying that anything I say here is not medical advice. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a clinician or anything like that. But I'm pretty well versed in the scientific literature, and that's what I can speak to. So with that disclaimer out of the way, um, I think this example you just raised is a really good one. So when it comes to cancer, does cannabis kill cancer? Well, that's a very hard question to answer because it's like, well, what cannabis are you talking about? What's the chemistry? What cancer? Not all cancer is the same. Even, let's take like breast cancer, for example. There are multiple types of breast cancer. There are multiple types of lung cancers, all these different things that with different underlying physiological mechanisms. So when we talk about cannabis and cancer, it's just an incredibly complicated thing. Certainly, there's preclinical research that has shown that if you expose a lot of different cannabinoids to cancer cells directly, it can, trigger apoptosis and sometimes autophagy. Which autophagy, I'll just back up. Apoptosis is the process of triggering a cell to basically self-destruct. Autophagy is this process that comes in and cleans up cellular debris. And they are linked processes, but separate, but they influence each other. And so cannabinoids do influence those things. Now, how does it scale from a preclinical study where you're looking at cultured cancer cells in a petri dish versus a human body? You really just can't compare those two things. And so one problem that we have in the cannabis industry, I think, is that because people are so passionate, a lot of times they see preclinical research or someone talks about preclinical research and they assume that research relates in some way to clinical research or clinical application. And time and time again, science has shown us that is a very bad assumption to make. One example is like we went through this with vitamin C. When I teach, I talk about vitamin C and THC a lot because they've gone through very similar paths. Like vitamin C in preclinical research kills cancer cells and has all of these interesting properties. There was the megadose phenomenon throughout the like 90s and early 2000s where people are taking huge amounts of vitamin C to try to stay healthy, and then research came out that showed like, well, actually maybe that doesn't really do much, and that preclinical data like may not translate so well. It's similar with THC and other cannabinoids and things. So we have to be careful in how we interpret what we read, especially, when like news companies are putting out articles about the effects of cannabis. A lot of times the articles are such an oversimplified description of the research that they often don't even point out those limitations of interpretation, or the journalist may not even understand that those limitations are there. And so it's not like a malicious thing. It is just a common, it's just ignorance. And it's understandable because a lot of people are not scientists and don't, and if they are scientists, they're not connected to clinical work. And so why would you, think about these things very hard if you're not exposed to it very much? So it's not like a bad thing necessarily that people don't always make this connection, but it's extremely common. There is research, like I had a podcast interview with Dr. Dadi Miri out of Israel that's doing, they have a whole lab focused. It used to be only focused on cancer and cannabis research. Now it's expanded into other conditions as well. But they found, that if you do enough research, you can come up with formulations of cannabinoids that can be pretty darn effective, even in clinical practice. but it's just a tricky thing. What he was explaining to me, some of the main things they looked at were like leukemia and breast cancer. And he's saying you have to know what type of cancer are you treating, very specifically, so that you understand the underlying mechanisms driving that. And then you have to understand what specific combinations of chemical constituents do you need together to target that, which is why some varieties of cannabis may have those constituents together, but are they in the right ratios or not? It gets really technical. And so that's why you may find a cannabis variety that is incredibly effective for something, but then you may never come across that variety again in the ratios and compositions that it needs to be in. So certainly cannabis can kill cancer, but how and how to really utilize that is much trickier, much more complicated.
As far as like, and I wanted to get to this point eventually, like talking about like federal legalization and and I shouldn't say like the community's opportunity to investigate more into cannabis and its potential healing possibilities. Like with federal legalization, do you feel like the opportunities exists for us to finally kind of start answering a lot of those questions and doing the studies necessary? It's like, no, we now know that these are the ratios that work. More specifically now, which one, is the perfect ratio that, that depends on the patient itself. But we do know that if we're working with this and we do this kind of extraction or what have you, like we'll more than likely have or we'll have at least some kind of, success rate, meaningful success rate.
Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into that. One thing I want to back up just to make sure I say, just to cap off the medical applications, I also want to point out that there is research indicating that cannabis can lead to worse outcomes in cancer as well. So I don't want to just present it as a, either a neutral or positive thing. There is a negative side as well. And there is research showing that some people have, depending on their cancer and what chemotherapies and stuff they might be on, primarily because of the immunosuppressant properties of cannabinoids, they tend to tell the immune system to shut up. That's not a good thing a lot of times. And especially depending on other drugs that you're taking. And also cannabinoids interact with the way the liver processes drugs and things. And so cannabis can lead to negative outcomes in cancer too. So I just wanted to put that out there, just to give the full rounded perspective there. Now with federal legalization,
you're right. And and I want to thank you actually for saying that. I think people need to be conscious of that as well. Of course, nobody would ever want somebody to be like, oh, I hear cannabis is good for cancer, so no, I'm going to start consuming cannabis.
Yeah.
Like that is not the direction that you need to go. Like there are a lot of things, like once again, like the cannabis experience is very personal. A person's illness is very personal as well. Like people need to be consulting professionals and doctors about things like that. Yes, Jason, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to try to find doctors that actually know anything about cannabis and cannabinoids, and that's the hard part. Although it's getting easier through telemedicine. COVID has changed things in some ways for the better, because now people have access to doctors, around the world that they might not otherwise have access to. When it comes to federal legalization, that can look like a variety of different things. It could be descheduling, where they take cannabis out of Schedule 1 and just completely deschedule it so it's not controlled anymore, which would mean the DEA no longer has jurisdiction over it. And it becomes a thing basically relegated to the FDA and the USDA as far as treating it like an agricultural crop, and then managing, what cannabis-infused foods and dietary supplements and cosmetics and stuff look like. And so that's one route, and that would have its own implications. That would be the ideal situation, just in that it would open up the industry in the way that a lot of people want, just basically turning cannabis into a legitimate agricultural crop that each state would come up with its own sort of restrictions on how it's handled, much like alcohol or anything else like that. And then we just move on and see how the industry develops. Now, another route that could be taken that's been talked about before, less so now, but it's still possible, because if they try to compromise with people that don't want descheduling, then we could see this, which would be rescheduling. So getting cannabis out of Schedule 1 and moving it to like Schedule 3 or Schedule 4, which would still be pretty problematic for a lot of people, because basically that would mean that you still couldn't have legal, cannabis infused foods, supplements, cosmetics, and all of that, but you could have pharmaceuticals. That causes problems for multiple reasons, and it relates to the hemp industry. The more pharmaceuticals that are developed from cannabinoids derived from cannabis, the harder it will be to legally produce cannabinoid products in the future. And it's due to this weird loophole, because cannabis has been prohibited for so long. It was not grandfathered in when a lot of FDA rules were developed. So, a lot of herbal extracts fall into, some of the basic FDA rules around dietary supplements and stuff. It's fairly straightforward on how to be compliant and handle that. And it's not super rigorous. It's not a big deal. But cannabis, it's not generally regarded as safe, and none of the constituents are generally regarded as safe. So GRAS, if you ever see that, GRAS, that's what that stands for. And so the problem is that if a company does research on a cannabinoid and creates a pharmaceutical, well, then you've got a drug, and you can't put drugs in food, and you can't put drugs in dietary supplements and cosmetics unless they are medical foods or, that sort of thing. And so this is already happening with CBD. It has happened with CBD. The FDA has claimed in multiple letters to companies, warning letters to companies, that because Epidiolex exists, which is a CBD pharmaceutical, that because there were no supplements with cannabinoids or supplements with CBD marketed prior to the development of this pharmaceutical, that, well, now CBD is a drug, and you can't be putting CBD, the drug, into other things. And so technically, based on the language that the FDA has given in these warning letters, really no CBD products on the market are federally compliant. They just haven't enforced that interpretation. And unfortunately, a lot of the precedent in our history on how drugs and supplements and stuff have been developed, there's not a lot that's very promising on how to get around that, unless Congress were to pass a specific law that made an exception for CBD, which they're trying to do. However, if they're not careful on the language of any proposed lawmaking that they do to create exceptions for cannabis, then you could run into the situation with every single cannabinoid in the cannabis plant. It's already, there are companies already developing pharmaceuticals for CBDV, for CBG, even THCV, but less so, because they generally try to stay away from quote unquote intoxicating cannabinoids or CB1 agonists. And so I worry that depending on how this all goes, it could create a system where you really only see pharmaceutical companies benefiting, and basically everyone else gets shut out. And that could happen through either of these models if Congress isn't careful on how they word these laws. And they're under a lot of lobbying pressure from all sorts of angles that end up dictating how they word these laws. And so I don't know how it's going to go. I don't quite know what the implications are going to be, because it really just depends. But what I would like to see would be descheduling, which would then allow us to treat the plant like, anything else. Like right now, if you're not in a state that has legalized cannabis in some way, if you're a testing lab and you want to do any work with cannabis, well, you've got to get DEA licensed, because cannabis is a scheduled drug, which means you've got to have some pretty robust security and tracking, and you've got to jump through a lot of hoops, and the DEA is oftentimes kind of slow to respond to things. So it's kind of a drawn out process. And even then, it's a ball game that really these labs, in my opinion, shouldn't have to play, because it's just it's not a danger to public health and safety, in my opinion. But that's the way it is right now. So descheduling would mean that, these labs can start to handle this material without worrying that feds are going to come kick in their doors and shut them down. It also means that universities can start to handle the plant more confidently without worrying that their federal funding might be pulled for any certain programs. And we're starting to see that with hemp. Now that hemp is legal, more and more universities are starting to do research projects. Oregon State University's launched like the country's largest hemp research facility. And so we'll see more and more of that. I've consulted with some universities across the country that are working on developing their own cannabis labs to focus on hemp first, and then with the idea that they'll be able to work with THC-rich varieties of cannabis later. And so that's all exciting, and how I hope to see things continue to go, because that will spawn an acceleration of understanding and knowledge that most of us can generally benefit from. Whereas right now, you're really relying on private companies rather than public institutions to deliver a lot of research and, kind of insider information about the cannabis plant and the science and everything. And it really shouldn't be that way. So I don't know. We'll see. The way the lawmaking process goes, things can start off looking really good and then fall apart really quickly. So that's why I'm like cautiously optimistic about, the things that Chuck Schumer says. It's like, I'd love to see that happen the way you're saying it will, but at the same time, you don't exactly have the power to make that happen.
You will become spineless in the moment of truth and not stand up for the way that it needs to get. All right. Well, now we're making broader comments on things, but that's a much deeper conversation for another talk and Toke. I'm not quite that lifted yet. All right. Actually, let's go to just a different hot button topic, actually, is extractions.
Okay.
Extractions are like, as far as safety is concerned and all that other kind of stuff, like I'll be frank, like I'm a flower guy. That's just what I'm comfortable with. Like I'm always down with it. I like the experience, and especially with the vaporizer. Like now flavor is a lot bigger point. Like I guess I'm looking at it from a different lens from other folks. But like when I hear when we talk about extraction and you got a resin or something like that, or a shatter, I should say. And you think, for me, thinking of something like butane, being used and then removed from it, still kind of has a thing inside my head going like, I don't know if I want to be consuming this at any level. Like, and this is not a criticism of folks that, that enjoy shatter and stuff like that and concentrates like that.
Sure, yeah.
It's just like my perception of it, and just, what I'm comfortable with, like as far as how I consume my cannabis. Because I love the ritual of the smoke. That's a big one. And you did an awesome podcast with a couple people about extraction, right? It was like 3 or 4 people. 3 people.
I spoke to let's see, there's Daniel Hayden from Extractioneering. Their main focus is like cured cannabis extractions, so sort of the opposite of like live resin. And then I've also spoken a couple times with Murphy Murray. He's based out of Colorado. He's a technologist, very knowledgeable about hydrocarbon extractions and separation techniques, that sort of thing. And a couple other people too. Wyeth Calloway as an organic chemist. One of my earlier episodes, he's kind of focused on essential oils. We've talked about that. So yeah, kind of tried to hit a spectrum. Also, Marcus Richardson, who's kind of focused on bubble hash and rosin. So I've tried to kind of hit a lot of the major different types of extraction to get those different perspectives. Yeah.
And like, once again, what it's come down to, as we've discussed, like, is personal experience. What are you looking to do? Like, what kind of relief are you looking for, right? Or what kind of experience are you looking for? And I think that really kind of comes down to like, as opposed to once again looking at a lens not from like, what's the best or as opposed to like, what kind of experience I'm looking for, and I think that's really what it comes down with extractions is Is that a reasonable kind of way to look at it?
I think to an extent. I mean, it's, when it comes to what extraction methods you want to use it. So certainly the experience is a part of it, in that, like, what kind of tastes are you going for? What kind of, other sort of characteristics, what sort of textures are you going for? Are you wanting a liquid, or are you wanting something kind of waxy, or do you want, more of a sort of semi-solid, like a shatter? That kind of stuff goes into it. Some people, they really like certain consistencies and textures, and how that relates to the chemical profile. And then there's also sort of the environmental side of it. What energy is being used to produce the extract, and what do you want your consumption impacts to be? And so, something like, I mean, obviously, like, dry sift is great in that regard, because it can be done manually and with very low energy. Although there's some really incredible scaled up technologies that are a little more energy intensive, but not like what you'd see with something like, say, CO2 extraction, where you've got temperature regulators and pumps, and vacuum pumps, and all sorts of other things that are driving the system. And then there's even more fancier technologies you can get into, where you can have different sort of assisted technologies. So you could do CO2 or a hydrocarbon extraction, or even an ethanol extraction, and you could essentially try to hit the system with microwaves, and
So I can build this in my garage, right?
a lot of people do. Talking about the
No shit.
talking about the Wild West of the cannabis. Oh yeah, I mean, out here in Oregon, I mean, that was huge. It's less so now, but certainly people were building these labs in their garages and at their houses and stuff in undisclosed locations. That yeah, I mean, that was fairly common.
That's
But
awesome. That's crazy. That's dangerous.
it is
Actually, kind of
dangerous, and
reminds me.
it exploded sometimes. Like, stuff happens. Oh, and that's the other piece that I didn't mention, is safety. So, different extraction methods are safer than others in the context of the person making the extract. Most extracts, if produced with some basic quality controls, are generally safe in the context of, residual solvents in general, from my experience, haven't been a huge concern. What is a huge concern in extracts are things like pesticides, mycotoxins, contaminants that may be found on the flower that will compound in the extraction and concentration process. Those sorts of things I worry about, and I think testing is really important. But residual solvent loads are not a very common issue from my experience, just seeing the data on a lot of samples. Certainly every now and then you see some weird stuff, and you have products now that are not true extracts, that are really more synthetic products or semi-synthetics, like a lot of Delta 8 THC on the market, should really be qualified as like a semi-synthetic. You're isomerizing CBD and turning it into Delta 8 THC for the most part, and that can lead to all sorts of wonky side chain reactions that produce compounds that we don't, in the lab, we don't know what they are. We just see them as mystery peaks on a graph, and we're like, I don't know what that is.
Thank you for letting me know that I'm being unreasonable about my concern about solvents being in the extraction.
Well, I mean, it's something you should definitely always want to see data on, because like I said, every now and then you see some pretty high numbers. It's just not as common as other issues that I see. And, like, going back to the Delta 8 THC thing, and you could potentially see it in other types of products. Like, sometimes you see like acetone in there, and I don't know that people are actually extracting with acetone. And I was talking to another scientist recently, and we're speculating, like, that's probably more, they're probably using acetic acid, and there's a transformation that's happening that's forming acetone. And that can become a fingerprint that lets you know that, okay, there's possibly some synthetic chemistry or something that has gone on to produce this product that then raises other questions. And, to kind of cap a lot of this discussion off, labs test for what they know to look for. And certainly, you can use a mass spectrometer to look for unknown compounds based on their molecular mass and everything. But to verify those sort of tentative identifications, it takes a lot of work. So when a lab result tells you that something is pesticide free, solvent free, whatever, it's telling you it's free of those things based on what they looked for. It doesn't mean that there are no pesticides in there. It doesn't mean there are no solvents in there. It just means that there are none of the solvents or pesticides they measured, according to the methods they used. And so you always have to reserve some space for the unknown. And as cannabis production techniques evolve, you could see newer techniques that could produce certain types of contaminants and things that labs don't look for. And an excellent example of this is pine resin, because black market shatter, there's a problem right now with people basically melting down pine resin and then kind of re-solidifying it and selling it as cannabis shatter. And I mean, that stuff could really hurt somebody, really, really, really gnarly, issues with that. But you're not going to see that on a lab test result, because the lab's not going to be testing for those things. Now, if they did a potency test, they'd probably see some really weird peaks. And if a lab is very ethical, they would probably raise that to the client. But at the end of the day, you can't control what that person's going to do. And, so it is what it is.
The unfortunate part is that the assholes seem to be kind of ahead of the curve on this one.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually heard a little bit more on a number of podcasts, actually on the Chillinois podcast. I remember hearing this, talking about how testing is kind of limited and how people are taking advantage of that. And it's like, oh yeah, you get these levels and stuff like that, but that really doesn't kind of tell you shit about how it's made, and that's a big deal. That's a big, big deal. And I guess it kind of all makes sense for it. Like, so for somebody who's coming from a beverage background, from a sommelier background, like when it comes down to wine, every single wine has a technical sheet now. Like very few places, it's a very small mom and pop places, in Italy or France, like they don't do them because they don't care, right? But everybody has a technical sheet now. That kind of stuff is very, very rare to find. Like you probably get a cannabinoid test and a terpene test, but as far as pesticides and all that other kind of stuff that that was taken care of, or if they're trying to pump up the the flowers themselves as well, like that never comes up on you'll never see it on the side of a container, and that stuff that's pertinent information.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is really important stuff for consumers to think about, because what I would ideally like to see when it comes to like lab testing rules is I'd really like to see those rules be driven by customer concern. It's like, what are you worried about? What do you care about? And then stacking on top of that, of course, from basic toxicology things, what do we know about that we absolutely have to look at regardless of what the product is to make sure it's safe. And keeping up with the culture, because it's like, if you scour the forums, you can find the people that are sharing the information on how to get around issues around testing. You can see the techniques they're using. And I'd really like to see some cannabis testing labs, or like a research and development laboratory or network of laboratories around the country and around the world that are not commercial. They don't make money off of the industry. They're solely focused on investigation work and trying to understand how products are made, what contaminants are in the products that labs don't test for. And, basically their role would be to issue suggestions on how lab testing should be updated year to year to keep up. This patchwork that we have is, I think, very dangerous, because as people get more and more clever, things tend to get more dangerous. You tend to get weirder chemicals and products that you would generally not see. And some of the chemicals that we see in some semi-synthetic cannabinoid products. I mean, we don't know what's going on, but we know that some of these molecules are kind of forming these really big molecules. So you have, terpenes and cannabinoids are pretty small molecules, but under the right conditions, you can pop off the right functional groups and things, and you can get some of these molecules to join together, sort of like a polymer. Well, when you start to get into these bigger fatty compounds, I mean, that's your lungs can't handle that. They can't. I mean, just think about it as like gumming up your lungs. You can cause lipoid pneumonia and things. And so uh, these are pretty significant issues. Unfortunately, the technologies are way ahead of the quality control and safety side of things. And in general, that's why I like to tell people just be careful about newer products and stuff. It doesn't mean that a newer product is necessarily bad or that some producer is malicious or anything, but I think a precautionary approach is definitely a good idea. Things like flour and basic hash and pretty simple extract products. We know a good bit about those things and how they're made and what to think about, what to ask a producer and all that sort of stuff. And so you can usually trust some of that stuff depending on where you live, because once again, it depends on what level of data you have access to. But then getting into some of the newer products, really heavily refined distillates and isolates, and some of the mixtures of products, usually, using heavily refined distillate products and mixing them with maybe essential oils that they're sourcing from somewhere else. It's like, well, what's the quality control on that ingredient? And it just starts to get into murky waters that people should just be a little cautious about, because the safety profile of the cannabis flower does not necessarily extend to all cannabis derived products. And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand. People have been interacting with the flower for thousands and thousands of years, and we have a pretty good sense of the safety profile of cannabis flower. And we have a pretty good sense of the safety profile of hash. But beyond that, we're really, the epidemiological studies are happening right now. So, it's like, do you want to be a test subject or not is kind of the thing. And I think that there's enough product variability already available that I think most people ought to be able to find things that work for them without having to get into, some of these questionable areas.
All right. Now we have great opportunity actually to frustrate the hell out of Illinois cannabis consumers. As somebody who lives in Oregon, I was explaining to you I bought an eighth of fairly dry herb about a week or so ago. The nugs turn to dust, when you pinch it, that kind of stuff. $60. This is premium in the state of Illinois. Say you wanted to go out to, a dispensary and pick yourself up something, for yourself, like for at the quality that I describe, what would you pay for such a thing?
Probably $3 to $5 a gram, I would imagine. If it was like really, as you described, like not very desirable, kind of really, really dry. I mean, the competition out here is so crazy, so having bud like that's really harsh, it just wouldn't hold up in a dispensary for very long. A lot of prices average, eighths anywhere from $20-$30 sometimes. Keep in mind that the rec market out here is pretty heavily taxed, so it could be cheaper, but that's generally where it sits. And but it depends on where you are. It depends on where you are, because like if you're in Portland, you got a very different experience than if you're at a dispensary at a place that may only have a couple in the middle of nowhere. Those are two very, very different situations. And but I'm just thinking about, I have a friend that runs a dispensary just down the street, and I'm thinking about his prices. And yeah, I mean, it's usually $4 to $6 a gram. Usually not more than that. And a lot of the Ace are usually around, 20, 25, $30, maybe 40 at the worst.
That's insanity. Yeah, like I mean, for us, it's very much a crapshoot right now. What you get,
Mhm.
the big boys have run the show. We've been trying to, people have been calling on the licenses, the permits, all that stuff to be
Mhm.
finally issued to folks. We had a short veil of social equity going on, and that dropped pretty quickly as well, especially when the new licenses came out. Didn't take
Oh
long for that to
gosh.
happen.
Yeah, once the money
Um,
starts moving.
yeah, exactly. And right now, like as far as consumers are concerned, medicinal patients and recreational folks as well. Like you get what you get.
Yeah.
Like you get what you get. Medicinal folks have a little bit more of an options on the menu, but when you go home, you open up a container of flour, you get what you get.
Yeah.
And it's just how it is here. It's just like
Yeah.
so like I asked you the most heavy question in Illinois right now, as far as the competition is concerned right now, but it was very 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 painful to hear. I'm very very jealous. Maybe one day. I have absolute no doubt that Oregon has serious issues as far as their approach to cannabis as well.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a process, it's an reiterative process that each state takes a stab at things, and every couple of years it changes and it keeps changing, and it'll be the same way where you are. It's just going to keep changing, and usually these states look at other states to try to get a sense of what's working and what's not, and depending on how conservative or liberal that state may be, will kind of generally dictate what pieces of the other programs in other states, they adopt. So you never know. It could evolve quite a bit, and it certainly will. And hopefully those prices come down for you. I remember Washington was in the same boat when they legalized. I remember I went to a dispensary shortly after they legalized, and it was around $60 for an eighth or so, which to me sounds like basically black market prices, and that kind of thing. It's sort of like, how are you going to dissuade people from using the black market if they already have black market connections, if the product's not cheaper? There's some concerns there, especially after I just talked about some of the very real hazards in the black market now compared to 10 years ago. um, but I don't know, have faith, it'll get better, and hopefully the lawmakers are paying attention, and hopefully people are voicing their concerns. I think people tend to get apathetic about politics, and I do think that sending even just basic emails to your representatives, and getting your friends and family and stuff to do that, it can be impactful when lawmakers have an understanding of where you would like to see things, and ultimately they want your vote. So if enough people voice their concerns or voice their opinions on how they would like to see things steered, you never know what can happen.
Yeah, man. I'm one of the things actually that I think is pretty awesome, and maybe this is just the folks that I see, in social media and stuff like that doing stuff, and they're all doing great stuff. Like there's a very vocal, community, I think, in Illinois right now, and there's a lot of people, you know, making their voices heard,
Mhm.
about the direction that cannabis should be going in Illinois. And I think positive things will be happening. We'll be going that direction. And once you said, it's just the evolution of legislation and the market and the culture and all that
Mhm.
other kind of stuff. It's not one single thing. It's a
Yeah.
biome of so much shit. Let's throw in free will and human beings into the situation and see how it all works out, right? All
Yeah.
right, now the most heaviest question I have for you might be too personal, but I really want to get this from you.
Okay.
I noticed your Batman behind you.
Ah,
Is there
yeah.
any other Batman than the 1989 Batman?
Ooh. Um, when it comes to cinema, I don't know, man. I really love Adam West, but just a separate thing altogether. Like Adam West Batman and Michael Keaton Batman, like they exist in separate universes in my mind, and I love them both for different reasons. But certainly out of the like serious Batman, to me, nothing compares to Michael Keaton's. Even though he can't move his neck in his bat suit. I just heard that they're working on a I guess a new movie that's going to have Batman from different dimensions, and Michael Keaton's going to be reprising his role as
All right.
in a limited capacity. So that's really exciting to me.
That's a very nice way to put it.
Yeah.
In a limited capacity.
Yeah, it's been pitched as possibly essentially Batman Beyond, if you're familiar with that, where it's old Bruce Wayne and is in the process of trying to retire and pass on his work to someone else, which I think it'd be cool to see that sort of story. Obviously I'm a huge Batman fan, huge Star Wars fan. There's a Yoda behind me somewhere too, if you can see
it. Yes, I noticed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dorks like that. It's just kind of radar up. Yeah. Actually, I held something above my head and made a noise like a Tusken Raider and made all of my co-workers uncomfortable today. And I was like, Star Wars? No, never never
okay.
mind. It's fine. I'm the weird guy at work. Awesome. Well, shit, Jason, this was the shit. This was awesome.
I enjoyed
man.
it. This is
I
great.
learned a lot. This is great. Once again, folks, to do the important part, Curious About Cannabis book, you can get it anywhere, right?
Pretty much. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you hassle your local Barnes & Noble or bookstore, sometimes they'll order it. That's just now kind of started to happen, but certainly online you can find it at most retailers. And then you can also, if you don't want to support Amazon or any of those big companies, you can buy it directly from me at cacpodcast.com/book.
Awesome. Yeah. So please buy it from Jason. It makes a lot more. This is a tremendous, reference for me and for you guys as well. Check this out very, very soon.
People watching this end up having questions, we could do a follow-up and address those. That'd be cool.
Hell yeah, we should do that. Let's work on that. All right, folks.
Awesome.
This wasn't thanks, Jason. Thank you. I gotta get better at this interviewing thing. Thank you, Jason.
It comes with time,
folks. Yeah. All right, folks. Thank you so much for tuning into this Talk and Toke. It was so much fun doing this. I want to thank Jason Wilson one more time. Thank you, folks, for tuning in, and I'll catch you at the next